In episode 8 of season 2 of BlenderStory, we're finally getting to Andy's chair. This episode is divided into 2 parts. In the first part, as always, we'll tackle UV unwrapping this model. But guess what? We're going to get familiar with an awesome feature in Blender called LiveUnwrap. On top of that, we'll explore a free add-on called TexTools, which gives us even more tools to make the UV process easier and faster. With this add-on, we can do many things that we had to do manually in previous episodes, but now with just one click. This saves so much time and make our workflow smoother. So the goal here is to UV unwrap objects faster and more efficiently. After taking care of the UV unwrapping, we'll move on to creating materials for this object, but we'll cover that in the next part. So for now, let's focus on getting everything ready here, and soon we'll bring this chair to life with some awesome textures and materials. So what are you waiting for? If you modeled this chair with me in season 1, open your project and let's get started. If you don't have the model for any reason, no worries. Just click the link in the description to download it and let's begin. Alright, in the first step, before we start UV unwrapping, we need to make sure the scale of all objects is set to 1. Now, in my scene, most of the objects already have the correct scale, but these ones don't. So, I'll hold Shift, select them, then press Ctrl A and choose a scale to apply it. There's also one more object that needs this, so I'll select it, press Ctrl A and apply the scale. The rest of the objects already have their scale set to 1, so we don't need to worry about those. Now, let's create a UV grid material. This will act as a guide to make sure our UVs are correct and that the textures display properly on the object. I showed you how to create a UV grid material back in episode 4 of this season. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend checking it out, especially from minute 9 to 10:27. But today, we're going to do this using a powerful free add-on that we'll be exploring in this episode. With this add-on, we can create a UV grid material super quickly with just one click and assign it to our object. Plus, it comes with tons of other useful tools that make the UV process way easier and faster overall. Of course, we're not going to go over every feature of the add-on right now. The goal is just to start exploring external tools so we don't limit ourselves to Blender's default options. The name of this add-on is TexTools, and I've included the link in the description. When you click the link, it will take you to the TexTools page on GitHub. It's super easy to install. Just click the green code button here and select Download Zip from the menu. Once it's downloaded, go to Edit, Preferences, then under the Add-ons section, click the little arrow icon here and select Install from Disk. Then navigate to where you saved the zip file, select it, and click Install from Disk again. That's it. Alright, let's see what this add-on can do for us. First, I'll split the viewport into 2 sections by clicking and dragging from the top left corner of the viewport to the right. Then I'll change this section to the UV editor. Once we're in the UV editor, I'll press N to open the side panel, and if you've installed the TexTools add-on, you should see its tab right here. Okay, now I'll select this object, and if I press Tab to switch between Object Mode and Edit Mode, you see it's not limited to a specific mode, which is great. So, whether you're in Object Mode or Edit Mode, you can still access TexTools and use it. Now, to create a UV grid material, it's super simple. First, specify the texture size here. I'll choose 2048 or 2K as an example. Then, just click the checker map button here to create the UV grid material. As you can see, it quickly creates the material and assigns it to the object we selected. It also switches the viewport shading to material preview, so we can see how the material looks on the object. Very cool, right? Every time we click the checker map button, it applies a different UV grid texture to the object, and you can pick whichever one you like. This is amazing. Can you believe how much easier it makes things for us? Okay, now let's assign the material to all the objects. I'll select everything and click the checker map button again. Alright, you notice that since we had already assigned the checker map to this object earlier, it's now using a different texture. To reset and apply the same texture to all objects, I'll click the trash can icon here to remove the checker maps from all objects, then click checker map again. Now, the same UV grid material is applied to every object we selected. Perfect. Now let's move on to the next step. While we're in the 3D viewport, I'll press Z and switch to solid view for now. Let's start making our seams. I'll select this object and press / on the numpad to enter local view. Alright, let's open the modifier properties panel here. You can see that we used 2 modifiers to create this object: subdivision surface and simple deform. And this one right here, that's actually added by the TexTools add-on to create the checker map material. So make sure not to delete it, because if you do, the checker material will be removed. Now, to start, I'll disable the simple deform modifier by clicking on this icon. And if I turn off subdivision surface as well, you can see that the original shape of the object looks like this. we need to apply this modifier so the object's shape gets closer to its final form. This way, when we apply textures, they won't stretch too much because of the shape changes. So I'll turn the modifier back on, set the levels viewport to 2, move my mouse over the modifier, and press Ctrl A to apply it. Now the original shape looks like this. Then I'll press Ctrl 2, which adds a subdivision surface modifier with the levels viewport set to 2. And if I toggle this modifier on and off, you can see there is hardly any difference between the smooth and original shapes. So this means the texture we apply will probably display correctly without stretching too much. Okay, next, I'll click and drag this modifier to position it above the simple deform, so the order of these modifiers stays exactly the same as before. We discussed modifiers in detail back in Season 1, so if you want to learn more about them, make sure you've checked out those episodes. Alright, now I'll temporarily disable the subdivision surface modifier so we can focus on marking seams. Okay, let's get started. First, I'll press Tab to enter edit mode, and in the UV editor, I'll enable this option called UV Sync Selection. This allows me to see the UV islands even when no components are selected. Okay. Now, let me introduce you to one of the Blender's coolest features that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, LiveUnwrap. When you enable this option, Blender automatically updates the UV unwrapping and packing whenever you mark or clear seams on edges. It's super easy and saves a lot of time. Let's try it out so you can see how it works. To enable this feature, remember that you must be in edit mode. You won't find this option in object mode. Okay? So right now I'm in edit mode, and then I'll press 2 on the top row of the keyboard to switch to edge select mode. Now look at the top right corner of the 3D viewport. There is an options menu here. If I open it, you'll see the LiveUnwrap option here. Let's go ahead and enable it. Okay, this is the back surface of our object. I'll hold Alt and click on this edge to select the edge loop. Then I'll press U to mark this edge loop as a seam. If I choose Mark Seam like usual, you'll notice something cool. Not only does it mark the edge loop as a seam, but because the LiveUnwrap option is active, it automatically unwrapped it in the UV editor. And even better, it packs the UV islands neatly into the UV grid. This is such an awesome and helpful feature. It simplifies our workflow so much. It means we don't need to manually select all components, press U, and then select Unwrap, and then go to the UV menu to pack the islands. Super convenient, right? Okay, let's continue marking the other edges as seams and finish UV unwrapping this object. I'll select this edge, hold Ctrl plus Shift, and click on this edge to select these edges. Then I'll hold Shift and click on this edge. Again, holding Ctrl plus Shift, I'll select this edge. Okay. Now let's repeat the process for the similar edges on the other side of the object as well. Alright. There we go. Now I'll press U again and choose Mark Seam. And immediately, you can see the UV islands update in the UV editor. Amazing, right? Now I'll press Z and switch to Material Preview to check the result. Okay. I'll also re-enable the subdivision surface and simple deform modifiers, and you can see that the checker map is displaying beautifully in the object. Okay, let's continue. If you look at the UV islands, you'll notice they need to be rotated 90 degrees, so the texture direction looks correct on the object, right? Let's see how we can easily do this using the TexTools add-on we just got familiar with. First, I'll press A to select both UV islands. Let me close the TexTools section here to give us more space. Now let's open the UV layout section, and you can see it provides a bunch of tools for arranging UV islands. Don't worry too much about all these tools. You don't need to learn them all right now. For rotating the UV islands, we only need these two options. 90 degree CCW rotates the selected island 90 degrees counterclockwise, and 90 degrees CW rotates them 90 degrees clockwise. So we'll just use the 90 degree CCW option here, and as you can see, it easily rotates the islands for us. Now, as you notice, the islands are outside the 0 to 1 UV grid, so to pack them inside, we can simply choose the crop option here. When we do that, the islands neatly fit within the UV grid. Perfect. Now I'll press Tab to go back to object mode, then press / to exit local view. Okay? Now let's move on to the next object. I'll select it and press / again to enter local view. This one is exactly like the previous object. It's super simple. First, I'll reduce the levels viewport of the subdivision surface modifier to 2 and apply it with Ctrl A and add a new subdivision surface modifier with a level of 1. Then, I'll move this modifier above the simple deform modifier. Also, I'll disable subdivision surface and simple deform. Next, I'll press Tab to enter edit mode, press Z, and switch to solid view so we can see the edges more clearly. Now, I'll hold Alt and click on this edge to select the edge loop. Then I'll press U to mark it as a seam. Again, because LiveUnwrap is enabled, you can see that it automatically unwraps and packs the UV islands. Now, I'll Alt-click on this edge, but note that I don't want to mark it as a seam. I've only selected it as a guide, okay? Then I'll select this edge, hold Ctrl plus Shift, and click on this edge to select it. On the opposite side, I'll hold Shift and select this edge, then hold Shift and Ctrl, and click on this one. Okay. Afterward, I'll go to the other side of the object and repeat the process to select the corresponding edges. Alright. Now I'll hold Alt and Shift and click on this edge which I had selected as a guide to deselect it. Then I'll press U and choose Mark Seam. That's it. Finally, I'll turn the modifiers back on and you can see that this object has been unwrapped just as easily. Alright, let's exit local view and move on to this object. Now to UV unwrap this object, let me introduce you to another really cool tool from the TexTools add-on. Let's say we want to mark this edge loop and this edge loop as seams for both of these objects. If I press U and choose Mark Seam like usual, you can see how the UV islands unwrap. Let me zoom in a bit here in the UV editor. Okay. If you watched episode 5 of this season, you might remember that now we need to straighten this UV island so the texture displays correctly and straight on the object, right? And to straighten the UVs, you have to select a face, flatten the edges around it along the X and Y axis, choose that face as the active face, press L to select the entire island, then press U again and choose Follow Active Quads. You can see that the process of straightening UVs involves quite a few steps. If you have many objects like this in a scene, it could become very time-consuming. But with the help of TexTools, we can simplify this process. Instead of selecting all of those edges, we can simply select one edge along the path. For example, I'll just select this edge and this edge. Then I'll click on EdgePeel over here. And yes, as you can see, it's amazing. It automatically marks all the edges as seams, unwraps the object, and straightens the UVs for us. This is an incredibly useful and practical feature for unwrapping cylindrical objects like this one. It makes the process much easier and saves a lot of time. As you noticed, we no longer need to manually straighten the UV island using the method I showed in episode 5. TexTools handles all those steps automatically for us. This tool is so handy that when you select an edge and press a U in the 3D viewport, you can even find it in the UV mapping menu. Now when I go back to Objects mode, you can see that in the areas where we marked seams, the texture is distorted. One of the main reasons for this is uneven topology, which I mentioned in earlier episodes. To fix this, let's go to Edit mode, press Ctrl R for loop cut, and add, for example, 6 edge loops to this section to make the faces more even. As you can see, these added edges help eliminate the distortion in those areas. I'll also add 6 edge loop to this side of the object. Okay, I'll add one more edge loop on either side of this section as well. And I'll do the same for the other side. Okay, let's add 6 edge loops here. And another 6 on the opposite side. Alright, that's it. Now you can see that the texture distortion in the areas where we marked seams has completely disappeared. Very nice. Now, let's move on to this object. There is a small but important difference between the mesh of this object and the previous one. If you look closely, this object has a cap face at its end, so it's closed. The previous object didn't have a cap face, it was open-ended. This small difference actually prevents the EdgePeel tool from giving us the result we want. For example, if I select this edge and click EdgePeel here, you see that everything looks like it worked correctly at first glance. But if you look closely, you'll notice that EdgePeel also marked these 2 edges on the cap face as seams, and those faces flattened along with the main cylindrical part of the object. In reality, what we need here is to mark this edge ring as a seam and clear the seams from these 2 edges on the cap face. Let's try that. I'll select these 2 edges on both sides of the object and clear their seams. Now, since the LiveUnwrap option is enabled, Blender tries to re-unwrap all the islands when we clear the seams, which immediately messes up the straight alignment of the island. So we need to disable LiveUnwrap to avoid this issue. Let me undo with Ctrl Z and temporarily disable LiveUnwrap here. Now if I clear the seams from the selected edges, you'll see that the islands remain untouched. Great! Now I'll select these edges on both sides of the object Press U and mark them as seams. Now, since LiveUnwrap is disabled, the islands stay intact. Okay, next, I'll simply select the cap faces on both sides of the object, press U, and unwrap them using the angle-based method. Now you can see that the textile density of these faces is different. So I'll press A to select all the islands, then go to the UV menu and choose average islands scale to equalize the textile density across all islands. Alright, as you can see, in the area where we marked the seams, we're still facing texture stretching. To easily fix this, just like we did for the previous object, we need to even out the topology by adding edge loops. Great. Now, I'll exit local view and let's move on to this object. I'll simply select this edge loop. Let's switch to solid display. Okay. I'll also select this edge and let me rotate a bit. Okay. Hold Ctrl Shift and click on this edge. Let me press period key to frame the object. Okay. I'll also add this one to my selection. All right. Finally. Okay. Next, I'll enable the LiveUnwrap option again. Press U and choose Mark Seam. Now you can see that the UV of the object has been unwrapped. And now we need to straighten this UV island horizontally. Fortunately, the TexTools add-on has thought of this step too and provides a powerful tool for us. Let me introduce it to you. It's called Rectify. This tool helps us easily straighten the UV islands we want. That means we no longer need to use follow active quads to straighten UV islands for objects like this one. It's super simple. First, we need to select the UV island. I'll press 3 on the top row of the keyboard to ensure Face Select mode is active. Then move my cursor over this island and press L to select it. Now we can choose Rectify from the UV layout section. But as you can see, this option is currently grayed out and disabled. So here's an important note. To use Rectify, you must disable the UV sync selection option. So I'll turn it off. And immediately, you see that Rectify becomes active. Okay, I'll move my cursor back over the UV island, press L again to select it. And now if I click Rectify, you can see the magic it performs. With just one click, it straightens the UV island so easily. It's absolutely amazing and makes the process incredibly simpler for us. Alright, now we just need to rotate this island by 90 degrees. So for this, simply click on this option here, and it will rotate the islands by 90 degrees for us. Okay, now feel free to turn UV sync selection back on so you can see the rest of the UV islands for the object. Just a heads up guys, EdgePeel is generally used for UV unwrapping and straightening cylindrical objects, while Rectify can be used for straightening non-cylindrical objects as well. Finally, since we used the mirror modifier for this object, there is no need to UV unwrap the other 3 objects because they will inherit the UV islands from this object we worked on. Now, only these back objects are left. So let's start with this one first. You can see that we used the mirror modifier for modeling this part, so I move my cursor over it and press Ctrl A to apply the modifier, giving us a single unified object. Then, in the subdivision surface, I'll change the levels viewport to 1, press Ctrl A again to apply it, and finally smooth it out a bit more by pressing Ctrl and 1 on the top row of the keyboard. Okay. I think 2 is better. Okay, that's it for now. Let's move on to marking seams. I'll temporarily disable the subdivision surface modifier, press Tab to enter edit mode. Let me rotate a bit, hold Alt, and click on this edge to select the edge loop. Then I'll press U and choose Mark Seam. Since LiveUnwrap is enabled, you can see how the UVs have already unwrapped and packed into the UV grid. Now notice how the texture becomes distorted as it approaches the corners, and the checker map isn't displaying properly. To fix this, we can use a different unwrapping method called conformal. Until now, whenever we pressed U and chose unwrap, we selected the angle-based method, right? This time, let's try using conformal instead and see the result. So, in the viewport, I'll make sure all faces are selected by pressing A, then press U, and choose conformal under unwrap. Now you can see how much better this unwrapping method works for this object. Finally, I'll re-enable the subdivision surface modifier, and here's the result. Just remember, whenever you're unwrapping an object, always check both methods, angle-based and conformal, to see which one gives you the best result, okay? Now, the only objects left are these ones. After selecting them, I'll press / to enter local view. Since they all have open caps, there is no need to manually mark any edges as seams. The edges around the open parts are automatically considered seams by default. So, I'll select all of them, press Ctrl J to join them into a single object, press Tab to enter edit mode, and press A to select all components. Then I'll press U and unwrap them using the angle-based method. Now, as you can see, we should also fix the texture rotation so it displays straight on the object. Instead of rotating each UV island individually, you can select all islands by pressing A, then click to align word in the TexTools add-on to correct the rotation. As you can see, the checker map texture now displays correctly and is aligned straight on the object. Alright, that's it guys. As you can see, we were able to UV unwrap and this chair model together quite easily. However, if you notice, the textile density across all the objects in this model isn't currently consistent. Let's quickly fix that. I'll select all the objects, press Tab to enter edit mode, move my cursor to UV editor, press A to select all the UV islands, then click on average UV islands from the UV menu. Now, the textile density is consistent across all objects. Alright, now we're fully ready to move on to creating materials for this model. But first, we need to pack these UV islands into the UV grid. Let's wrap up this episode here and leave packing the UV islands and creating materials for the next episode. So make sure to practice what you've learned in this episode thoroughly before the next one, so you'll be completely prepared for what's coming next. Guys, thanks a lot for sticking with me until the end of this video. I'll see you in the next episode.